Dota 2 is a game that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Some view it as this pinnacle of skill and technique, requiring the strongest of minds. Others consider it a clown fiesta with some of the most absurd interactions out there. Many view it as the scourge of gaming, filled with some of the most toxic users. To me, it's a lot of things. I've been playing Dota 2 for only a few years now, just under 1,000 hours total, which is very low compared to many out there. But it's hard to pin down exactly what Dota 2 is to me, because it's a game that holds so many qualities for me. Which honestly makes this video a bit challenging to make, because why I love Dota 2 is a very all-encompassing question. I also want to make it clear that this video is not a guide on how to play Dota 2, or a tutorial. It's more of a sales pitch, I guess. So I'm going to try and cover some of these elements one by one for what the game means to me, and hopefully I've made some form of a case by the end. And just to be honest, this video is not going to be focused primarily on even the gameplay of Dota. Gameplay, of course, is a very big part, but actually what drew me into the game at all was the characters and writing. So, Dota 2 has a bunch of heroes within it, and even more characters that are relevant. I have absolutely no hope of covering each and every one of them in this video with any depth, so I'll try to talk semi-broadly, but I'll hone in on an example or two of characters that I really enjoy. I think the writing of Dota is honestly severely underrated, or at least underrepresented. A lot of people seem to overlook it and borderline forget that it's definitely still a game written by Valve. This really shows in a lot of the characters, both in their stories and their dialogue. A nice example that we'll start with is Axe, though his real name is Mogul Khan. Axe really seems like a big one-note character, and in some ways he is. He's very much a big, kind of dumb guy who loves his weapons so much that he just calls himself it. Axe's initial lore was that he was a grunt in the Red Mist army, but he wanted to rise the ranks. So, Axe utilized his wild fighting stance to both slaughter his enemies, but also kill higher-ups from his own army. He kinda just kept killing and killing, not caring who got caught in the crossfire. Axe kept this up enough to the point where he became leader of the Red Mist army, though there were no longer any soldiers left for him to lead. All of Axe's troops had either died in battle or were slain by Axe himself. However, he doesn't really care. He takes pride in winning all of his battles and becoming the general. This is a pretty fun set of lore for a hero. It fits his gameplay extremely well, just jumping in and causing chaos. And it definitely fits the way he carries himself around the map, referring to himself as Axe in third person and not being the most eloquent speaker.
Axe gains strength!
Now, if this was all Axe had going on, he'd be a fun character in the writing department. Something about someone so entranced in battle and uncaring of just murking his higher-ups, it's pretty funny. However, Axe's story continues. After he pretty much single-handedly led the Red Mist army to both victory and ruin, he went on as an adventurer with his bard Goodkind. Now Axe just kinda roams around, going on adventures with the details written by Goodkind in novels. We're given some insight into what these are like in one of the official Dota comics, where we see Axe on one of his adventures, though him and Goodkind seem more concerned with the book being written about it, as opposed to the quest itself. In the comic, we also hear about that Axe has clearly been doing this for a good while and has made quite a name for himself, with the books at some point being very popular, leading to him becoming rather famous. Furthermore, while many looked far past Artifact, which was the Dota card game, it held an abundance of really well-written lore and details for many of the characters. In regards to Axe, we got to learn about more of his various adventures.
I've written a lot of books about Axe, the most popular of which is easily the Roshan Expedition. Personally, I think Red Mist Red Passion is better, but people heard erotic thriller and never gave it a chance.
Circling back to the comic, we learn of how Axe actually ended up in the Battle of the Ancients, which is what you play in a game of Dota. See, I've forgotten to mention a detail that is both important and something I find extremely cool, which is that every game of Dota is actually canon. The explanation being that a game of Dota is at the end of a timeline. The reason for which I won't get too into, as it could be its own video entirely and plenty of lore channels have given their own explanations of it, but basically, at the end of a match of Dota, time is reversed, starting back from the beginning. This leads to effectively infinite timelines, with the primary goal, revealed in Artifact, of finding a timeline where the two ancients tie. Now, how does this tie into Axe? Well, it explains why Axe, who is a very distinguished character, may be on the side of Dire or the side of Radiant, and it's not weird for him to be just chilling with anyone else. However, this ties in further because with every game of Dota being canon, that also means every cosmetic in the game is canon. Which is where we come to Axe Unleashed, which is a special cosmetic for Axe where he loses his namesake. I bring this up because we're given even more story for Axe in general and how he happened to lose his axe, which I think is very cool.
Just when Axe was ready to kill the wounded Grifftalk, it jumped into the river. The tiny scribe said it didn't matter, but it mattered to Axe. So Axe went into the river, but swimming was too hard. The fight was unfair with Axe's axe, so Axe had to drop it. After Axe choked the beast, it made a good raft. That was nice, because Axe needed a nap. Axe woke up when the Grifftalk raft went over a waterfall. Then Axe hit his head on a rock and got sleepy again. Now Axe is alone with no axe. The only law here is jungle law, and Axe's fists are enforcers.
So, look at that. We even get backstory for the cosmetics here, and I bring all this up and discuss it to both give a baseline for how characters are written in Dota, and to show that there's a lot of attention to detail put into it. Of course, not every hero is given this much love, but a lot are. I'm sure it's no surprise then why I find Dota lore and all of its writing really enticing. My first exposure to it was actually when I played a lot of Dota Auto Chess, which was a mod that you've probably heard of to some degree. The auto battler genre kind of blew up because of it, and it was extremely popular on Twitch and other streaming sites. So I got into auto chess very deep, played a couple hundred hours, and the heroes within it all have voice lines that they would do very often, and they really started to dig into my head. And after those 100+ hours, I decided enough was enough, and that I needed to play the actual game that sources these characters and voice lines that I just couldn't stop thinking about. So I could go on a lot longer about the more in-depth stories and lore for a lot of the heroes, because there are just so many that I find really interesting and just fun above all else. Tusk and Bristleback just constantly bar fighting each other, Timbersaw's shaky relationship with trees, or Tinker literally just being Gordon Freeman. So instead, let's start to bridge the gap between story and gameplay by first giving a brief set of basics for both why I love Dota and mechanics and heroes that I just find really interesting. So first, why did I choose Dota over any other MOBA or game like it? Well, as I mentioned initially, I was actually drawn to Dota because of the heroes in it. But then as I started to play, I got engrossed in the mechanics. For some history, I actually played a pretty notable amount of Heroes of the Storm in the past, which was Blizzard's take on the genre. It didn't involve last hitting for gold to buy items, or really much of anything outside of team fighting and objectives. I actually enjoyed HOTS quite a lot, and played it with friends, and had a grand time. The hero designs within it were creative and fun to mess around with, while also being simple enough to not feel alienating. So my jump to Dota from it was a little rocky. Dota is a very overwhelming game. There's a lot to pay attention to, a lot of places where you can mess it up. However, I think what really started to help me come to grips with playing it was understanding that while Dota has a lot of rules, for the most part, it will play by those rules to the letter. Once you start to understand the absolute tons of mechanics and elements at play at a basic level within a game of Dota, you can start to understand how this applies to fringe moment-to-moment interactions very well. In some ways, it's almost like learning how to play an instrument. At first, you have to learn how to read music, understand general ideas of how playing an instrument functions, and then you can start to overlay those fundamentals with more detailed situations. Syncopation, funky time signatures, vibrato, improvising. There's a lot to sink your teeth into, and trust me, Dota is no different. Dota is a game that is so overwhelming and can be so stressful that, especially once you're first starting, at least in my case, I had to almost be hyper aware while playing. Constantly keeping track of so many things, both very vague things like, am I where I should be right now? Could I be spending my time in the match doing something better than what I'm doing? To more specific things, should I stun here and go for the kill? Am I strong enough to fight? Or should I go hit some creeps and make money right now? I'm trying to keep things basic here because I intend for this video to be for people who don't play or haven't played much of Dota, so any Dota players watching may snobbily laugh at these examples, but I wanted to keep them basic. Anyway, that all sounds like a lot, I'm sure, but that's because it is a lot. However, what I found most satisfying in my almost 1,000 hours in Dota is once things like that become second nature, when I don't have to actively think about these things and I just know. I know when I'm strong enough to start going around and kill enemies. I know where I should be and what I should be doing. That is what is the most satisfying part to me. Of course, my gameplay isn't perfect. Hell, it's probably downright bad in a general sense. However, the fact I have a basic comprehension of these ideas is what makes it so satisfying compared to a few years ago when I just had no clue at all. And don't get me wrong though, ideas like this to many may seem extremely off-putting. The idea of learning a game almost like a job, seeming not to your liking, is very normal. Trust me, Dota is not a game for everyone. It takes a lot of patience to learn and you probably need to really get into it. However, I happen to fall into that definition. I think a big part of it is that compared to other games where you really have to stop and learn them, and this is actually something I've mentioned in my video on Faust, is I really enjoy decision making and strategy in games and I struggle with execution, which Dota compensates very well. There are plenty of heroes that actually require extreme levels of execution, mostly those who involve micro, which is a term that means controlling things that aren't your primary hero. Examples of which would be like Visage, who has his birds that you control, or Meepo, where you can control up to 5 copies of him all at once. And if any of them die, they all die. I'm just using these as examples of heroes who have really high levels of execution. This also applies to any hero with extremely important skill shots like Mirana or Pudge. You could spend a long time learning specifically how to properly execute these things. However, in spite of those examples, in general, I consider Dota to be a game that is more focused on things like decision making and strategy, as opposed to raw execution. After all, there are some heroes who are brain dead easy on a mechanics level as well, and this is where my enjoyment of the game probably comes into play. I really like thinking about all of these overlaying mechanics in the context of decision making. As I mentioned, once I started to have certain ideas come as second nature to me, that's when I could start to think about things in more abstract ways with new methods or concepts. And that's probably where something like item builds come into play. For those who don't know what items are in the context of Dota, they're primarily how you'll power up within a match. You buy items with gold that you get from killing creeps, which are those little guys. You also get it from killing heroes or other big things like taking towers. Dota has a lot of items, and they all do unique things. Some just function as stat sticks and make you beefy, while others have very complicated effects like detailed passives or actives. Knowing how to itemize and set up your build in a game can be a key element of winning. Picking up the right item at the right time is pretty much fundamentally how a game of Dota is won. Whether this means something like buying a blink dagger as an initiator so you can teleport into a group of enemies and start a fight with a big stun, or it could be buying a Black King bar, which when activated makes you immune to pretty much most spells in the game, meaning you can pretty safely just do your thing without getting stunned or interrupted. Those are items you'll likely see very commonly, so they aren't the best example for what I'm describing, but here's a more fringe example that falls into what I was describing earlier with decision making, and I'm going to explain every step of it, so don't worry about getting lost, hopefully. Alright, so say that I'm playing as Anti-Mage, who's a very standard carry hero. He just goes around the map, gets gold for most of the games, and then by the time he has a lot of items, he just goes ham and kills everything on the other team. The important detail here is that Anti-Mage is going to be dealing the majority of his damage by auto-attacking, which is just when you right-click the enemy and tell your hero to attack them. Now, let's say that the other team has a Phantom Assassin, who is similarly a carry hero, but the important aspect here is that she has a really high evasion stat from her passive. This means she has a very high chance to dodge my auto attacks from Anti-Mage, meaning I'll do very little damage to her just on average. Normally, this could lead to me being completely out of luck because she'll just dodge all of my damage and kill my team, leading me to be pathetic and alone. However, I, as the Anti-Mage, thought ahead and accounted for this, which is why I bought the item Monkey King Bar. What Monkey King Bar does is it gives you some stats like attack speed and damage, but most importantly, it gives you a very high chance to pierce evasion, meaning you're much more likely to be able to damage Phantom Assassin in spite of her passive. So that was a very specific case of using item builds and decision making to win a game, because likely had I not purchased Monkey King Bar, I would just be getting run over by Phantom Assassin. Of course, this isn't the grandest example in the world, but I wanted to pick something very basic to get my point across and not make it too complicated. Situations like this crop up all the time within Dota, some much more obvious and some much more obscure. So now, there's a lot of depth in play just in regards to what items you buy and when you buy them. And I haven't even gotten to heroes yet, which now I'll do, because I think a lot of heroes in Dota are excellently designed and their set of spells are very pristine. Dota has a design philosophy that I find very interesting, where every hero is designed to be overpowered in doing one thing very specifically. For some, admittedly, what they're overpowered in can be more general while some are more niche, but this means that hypothetically, no matter how messed up the current patch is for a hero, they might still see a situation where they're very useful. Furthermore, I think the kits in Dota are designed in a way that's really fun and encourages thought in your spells. A lot of heroes are obviously designed to be synergistic with themselves, and a lot of their spells play very nicely together. However, what's fun to me is a lot of these synergies aren't necessarily forced. This is going to be something that's kind of difficult to explain, so bear with me here. To explain this concept, I'm going to go with Axe, since we know this guy pretty well by now. So, his first spell is Berserker's Call, where when you cast it, all enemies around Axe are taunted, forced to attack him, and Axe gains bonus armor while this is going on. So, he takes much less damage than he normally would from enemy auto attacks. Berserker's Call is a great initiation tool, as it's basically a really long AoE stun, as the enemies can't do anything but attack Axe for its duration. However, it's also got a lot of synergy with his kit that I'll circle back to later. Next up is his second spell, Battle Hunger, in which you basically apply a damage over time to the target, and they are slowed when facing away from Axe. These effects are cancelled if the target kills a unit while being affected by it. This spell is really strong for just generally harassing the opponent, especially ones who aren't going to be killing anything, as it can add up to a lot of damage. However, it also serves as a really good tool for chasing. This is because they're slowed by such a hefty amount at max level when facing away from Axe, so their two options are to either face Axe and fight, or run away slowly. This lets Axe get close to them and makes it much easier so he could activate Berserker's Call and lock them down. Also, something important is Battle Hunger now does extra damage based on how much armor Axe has. This synergizes with Berserker's Call even further because it gives Axe an extra 30 armor, basically giving Battle Hunger another 30 DPS. Axe's last basic spell is actually a passive, Counter Helix. Basically, this passive gives Axe a chance to, whenever he's attacked by anything, he'll spin in retaliation, dealing damage to everything around him. I doubt I really have to explain the obvious synergies at play here, but just in case, this passive is really powerful when combined with Berserker's Call, because when Axe jumps into the middle of a bunch of enemies and forces them to attack him, he'll just start spinning crazily and doing large amounts of damage to all of them. The passive is also just generally useful for things like killing creeps, as it's easy to force them to attack you while not needing to spend any resources, which makes it a nice wave clear. And lastly, Axe's ultimate, which is Culling Blade. Culling Blade pretty much is just a basic damage spell doing pure damage, so it can't be reduced by mostly anything. However, what makes it fun is that if you kill someone with Culling Blade, it'll execute them and instantly reset its own cooldown, and give you and your allies a speed boost, and give Axe some extra armor, permanently. So, the way this plays with Axe's entire kit is the idea that you jump into the middle of a bunch of enemies, taunt them with Berserker's Call, deal heavy damage to them with either your team or Counter Helix, maybe even Battle Hunger, and then you finish them all off with Culling Blade. And lest we forget, that extra permanent armor that you gain from Culling Blade kills, both is just very nice. Reduced damage is always a good thing, but better yet, it's like getting some extra permanent damage added to your Battle Hungers. That was a lot to explain. However, I hope it gives you an idea for what I was describing when I talk about spells that all have their own functionality but play extremely well together. I could go over a list like that for pretty much every single hero in the game, as they're all designed with these ideas in mind. But instead I want to circle back to how crazy some Dota heroes can get, because I think it's really fun. One of my favorite heroes who's more out there is Rubik, who is like the ultimate wizard. I'm not going to go spell by spell for Rubik, but basically the most important thing about him is that he's a better wizard than you and everyone else. This manifests in gameplay with Rubik's ultimate ability, which is actually the ability to steal an opponent's spell. This works in the way where when you cast Rubik's ult on an enemy, you get a copy of their last used spell, and this can be done to every single spell in the game. If you can cast it, Rubik can steal it, though he can only hold it for a limited time based on how many levels into his ult he has, starting at 3 minutes and capping out at 5 minutes. But even better, he can use it better than everyone else. This is because of his passive and certain other upgrades he gets. His passive increases his cast range universally, allowing you to use spells further than the opponent could, and it gives him a universal spell amp, meaning he'll do more damage than his opponent would. Even more, at higher levels in a match, his stolen spells will have a lowered cooldown. And even better, he eventually gets a huge spell amp specifically on stolen spells, so he'll do way more damage than his opponent would. I think Rubik is just so cool, and I failed to mention that spell steal itself has a pretty low cooldown, especially at max level, so you may be constantly switching out what you're stealing and blasting spell after spell in a hectic fight, using your own enemy's tools against them. And that's lest I forget that the item Aghanim Scepter, which is an item that has a unique effect on every hero, well, when Rubik has it, he can hold on to 2 stolen spells at once, which creates a lot of interesting and crazy combos. Anyway, that's one hero who I like to highlight in regards to designs that are notably cool, and because he's simple enough to explain, it's a good one that I like to gravitate towards. Another unique hero that fills a very different niche, but is also pretty easy to explain, is Nature's Prophet. I think he's a fun hero to highlight because the reactions to his kit from people who don't play Dota are almost universally funny. So, what Nature's Prophet does, if I had to summarize it, is that he can globally teleport freely anywhere on the map. There's just a cooldown. And he can summon treants from trees that you manually control, or micro. He also can summon a ring of trees at a location, which has a large variety of uses that I won't get into. And lastly, his ult is a spell that does damage to every enemy you have vision of, and gives a temporary damage boost for any enemies killed by it. This leads to Nature's Prophet primarily being used for split pushing, which is basically the act of going into a lane where nobody else is and just running down it, killing creeps, and trying to take enemy towers. Since he has a global teleport for free, he can just go wherever he wants and leave pretty much whenever he wants. And the treants serve as great fodder for taking out towers. What makes Nature's Prophet so funny to me is, in reactions, a lot of people hear about him and think he must be game-breakingly OP. The idea of a hero who can just teleport anywhere he wants for free and push out lanes must be ridiculous. However, he's really just average, maybe even bad. I need to check the stats. And that's just how Dota is. Now, I know this video is already quite long, and I could go on for much longer, but I need to find somewhere to cut it, and this is as good a place as any. I could definitely, however, make videos that go more in depth on specific heroes that I personally really enjoy, on both the mechanics and writing level, as there are plenty of those. Anyway, hopefully though, after all of this, you can start to understand why I love Dota 2. And maybe I even convince you to give it a try. It has a built-in tutorial that's pretty in-depth, however, you'll still need to accept that, even after many bot lobbies and practice, your first few games are going to be a struggle, but that's the fun of it. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you've already liked and subscribed by now. I'll see you in the next video.